Now on BBC One, The Seventh Enemy.
This extraordinary house in which I work often seems to me like an image of the rich nations of the Northern Hemisphere. But today our gilded castle seems threatened by rumours of doom, its proud confidence shaken by dangers we can no longer ignore.
The U.S. Defense Secretary, Mr. Harold Brown, has said that the United States is prepared to protect its vital interests, including Middle East oil, by military force if necessary. Mr. Brown had been asked on American...
A French playwright once said, "It is the privilege of the great to watch catastrophe from a terrace."
After the Soviet warning to China to stop before it was too late.
Today, all of us are becoming anxiously aware, not only of crises in Britain, but of forces imperiling mankind's whole future. Questions undreamed of by our forebears have become the common currency of daily news bulletins. The energy crisis, urban terrorism, world hunger, the population explosion, the poisoning of the environment, the nuclear arms race that could incinerate us all. But the dangers seem so many and so intractable that we find it hard to make sense of them, let alone decide what to do about them before things get out of control.
But all is not what it seems in this strange house. In fact, it's been given over to the work of the Richmond Fellowship, where Ronald Higgins is now Assistant Director. This international charity runs a network of special hostels for the mentally ill and emotionally disturbed. After careers as a diplomat and writer, Ronald Higgins has recently joined the Fellowship, part of his own response to a global crisis that first came home to him 5 years ago.
Why does there seem to be more and more bad news these days? Does all the gloom reflect no more than the media's need for crisis headlines, fed by the theatrical exaggeration of the professional doomsters? Or are things really getting worse? 5 years ago, when I worked here at The Observer with the editor David Astor, he asked me to write a long article for the Colour magazine, which would try to make sense of the global outlook, as I saw it. It was a commission which was to change the course of my life. He asked me to look beyond the current commotions, the daily bread of most journalists, and try to put together some overall pattern that might put our immediate troubles into a longer-term context. I began searching libraries, interviewing experts, and looking for the images that might illuminate what was happening. As I sorted through this jumbled catalogue of deprivation and destruction, it seemed to come down in the end to 6 great underlying threads. We all know that population experts can get things wrong, but the undeniable trend is of relentless population increase, particularly in the poor south, where death rates have been falling dramatically. Just 100 years ago, the population of the whole world was only 1 billion, 1,000 million souls. Today, that 1 billion has become 4 billion, and short of a Holocaust, we're likely to reach 8 billion within the next 40 years. I just hadn't realized it was already too late to prevent this next doubling. The mothers of the next generation are already alive. Birth control has been a story of too little, too late. And anyway, loops and condoms alone cannot be the answer, because poor families need children for security in their old age. The second great threat is starvation. Apart from the tens of millions who die each year, the World Bank reckoned there were 300 million kids who had suffered permanent mental damage, not just physical, through malnutrition. I discovered the problem was less the scarcity of food in the world than the savage injustice in the way it is shared. Most of the human family lack what the economists coldly call effective demand. They can and do starve outside bulging stores of grain, a simple image of a mad world. Miracle seeds, artificial foods, even bigger harvests can be almost irrelevant while our pet cats have more buying power than African babies. Then there's the third threat. If one's to believe the projections contained in the influential report, The Limits to Growth, we're using up the planet's mineral resources at a frightening rate. To bring these forecasts up to date, think of it in terms of a baby born this year. By the time she's 21, the gold mines will be exhausted. If she wants a wedding ring, it'll be made out of recycled gold. By the time she's 35, there would be no new silver. And in her early 40s, there would be no more petrol for her car or natural gas to cook with. When she reaches her 70 years and 10, the world would have run out of lead, copper, and tin. I realized that another great range of the world's problems could be grouped under the heading of the degradation of our environment, the fourth threat. This degradation derives not only from the poisons with which we accidentally or deliberately insult the subtle web of life, but through the almost systematic conversion of our Earth into dead seas, dust bowls, and concrete jungles. Man has crashed into biological history, scarcely knowing what he's doing. And almost by accident, our ingenuity has unlocked the power of the sun. We instantly created the fifth threat, the nuclear, which could so easily leave one great scorched Earth as the only memorial to a glorious failed experiment, Homo sapiens. 7 powers have nuclear weapons. Another 15 could probably develop them at a year's notice, and 20 or more could soon follow as nuclear power technologies proliferate. Meanwhile, the increasing use of nuclear power stations is bringing closer the day of the plutonium black market and nuclear terrorism. The more I thought about the problem of nuclear abuse, the more I saw it in a wider context, a sort of sixth threat of science and technology galloping beyond human control. Knowledge brings power, and men abuse power. Leonardo invented a submarine and decided he wouldn't publish, he wouldn't divulge the design. And I was fascinated to discover what his reasons were. I do not publish or divulge on account of the evil nature of men who would practice assassinations at the bottom of the seas by breaking the ships in their lowest parts and sinking them together with the crews who are in them. Now, it is not just a question, so it seemed to me, of what we do. The fact that, most modern scientists will tend to say publish and be damned, and so-called neutral research will suddenly become molecular and biological warfare and the rest. It's a question of what we don't do. It's a question of the allocation. And when I looked into it, I discovered that about half of the world's research is on military equipment, new weaponry of extraordinary kinds. A very large chunk of the remainder is on commercial gadgetry, lavish consumer goods, or space exploration, prestige projects, and so on. And meanwhile, the problems of semi-tropical agriculture, which have got such a bearing on world hunger, problems of medicine in the third world, are, relatively speaking, neglected. I mean, a few percent only, it turned out, were of the world's immense scientific talent was devoted to these pressing areas where 2/3 of the world's population are in need and have those needs not met. We transplant hearts, and the rest of the world, much of the rest of the world, lacks for even the most elementary medicine. By the time the article was finished, its conclusion was pretty bleak. The 6 threats were converging fast, and in a world ominously split by the still widening poverty gap between the rich north and poor south. Might southern hunger and anger even grow into a north-south war of survival? We were forced to ask an astonishing question. Is the world committing suicide? I'd been worried that the article might lead many into despair. So I was very moved that so many of the 7,000 people who wrote in responded positively, asking what they could do to help.
I live in one of the most affluent parts of Britain. A few years ago, I worked for a while amongst some of the poorest people on earth, who eke out a bare living amid the steep mountains of Central Africa. Your logic is right. We are losing the ability to love and care for others and to understand that mankind really should be a brotherhood. In other words, we are living in a fool's paradise.
I'm a Liverpool student in my final year. There are many possible uses to which I could put my degree in microbiology. For example, to undertake research into cancer. But the question that immediately arises in my mind is that cancer is a disease of the rich Western society who have been cured of all other...
As a pensioner, I wonder if the West will wake up. I doubt it. Greed will drag us down to the inevitable gutter. I would like a few of the leaflets to do my bit to awaken a few thinking people. If the Observer...
I am doing a project with the children in school on the topic. I find that children are far more aware and informed than we are. Sister Cece.
However, I do hope you appreciate the irony of writing an article about the dangers and evils of overproduction in a glossy Sunday color supplement. On every page are adverts which totally negate what the article was saying. I accuse you of letting the middle class indulge in thinking that they care about the state of the world while doing absolutely nothing about it. David McKelvey.
Just a line to say how much I admired rather than enjoyed your article. I can only sing with Maurice Chevalier, I'm glad I'm not young anymore. House of Commons, Tuesday the 27th.
People may become less anaesthetized to pictures of starving people when they understand how this relates to their own survival. It's time to persuade governments to think the unthinkable. We must lobby, leaflet, letter write, till we rock the air.
Certainly governments do bear a heavy responsibility for the mess the world's in. And there's little doubt that global threats require a global response. Individuals feel powerless by themselves and have every right to demand international action far bolder and more imaginative than any we've so far seen. Yet few governments seem prepared to translate the flood of words into anything more than a trickle of aid and minor reforms. Fundamentally, the picture remains one of profound political inertia. However, this isn't as surprising as it seems. For 12 years, I worked in our diplomatic service, abroad and here in Whitehall. Government is a much more treacherous craft than most people realise. There have always been powerful vested interests, not all bad, and frequent emergencies. But the volume of work has become staggering. In these offices, there's rarely time to look ahead. The atmosphere is one of crisis management, not composed, long-term planning. For the most part, those who rule us are swept up in the stream of events, trying to keep head above water, trying most of all to look confident, however uneasy and helpless they feel. I came to believe that more serious than any of the 6 threats was the human factor, the 7th enemy. If our world collapses, it will not be because the six threats are invincible. There is nothing inevitable about our fate. It will be because we lack the political will and moral courage to confront them. But such sentiments can be little more than empty idealism, unless we take account of the prodigious constraints within which governments have always had to work. In surroundings as grand and powerful as this, it's easy to imagine that governments are all powerful. But it's not like that. The difficulties of government are such that one of the usual phrases around here is masterly inaction. That by and large, it's better to do nothing than make things worse. But what's more important than any of that, what limits governments and their powers much more effectively than the sheer difficulties, is you and me, the consensus of public opinion within which any government, even the Kremlin, has to operate. They're limited by our values, our priorities. So you get a British Minister of Agriculture at a Food and Agricultural Organization conference saying, my responsibility is to British electors, not to starving Indians. So the essence, it seems to me, moves much more towards not so much political inertia as such, but our own moral blindness, our own participation. The buck doesn't stop with the presidents and the prime ministers. It stops with you and me. My growing preoccupation with our personal responsibility for the global crisis led me to leave my work in London and settle in a Herefordshire cottage to pursue the search within myself. With no salary coming in, I had to live on only a few pounds a week. So simplifying my life and growing my own food was more than just a fashionable ideal or a nod towards ecology. It was the only way I could survive. But I soon learned that complete self-sufficiency was impossible, not just for me. In a mass society, there are just not enough acres to go round. And self-sufficiency can be just another kind of selfishness. It was not enough just to cultivate one's own garden. I hadn't come here to escape from the world, but to explore in thought and feeling this idea of a seventh enemy which must first be confronted within ourselves. For 3 years I worked here, enlarging the theme of the article into a book. Journalists tend to be melodramatic, so the first thing was to check the basic facts. As I ploughed through statistics and reports, it seemed that the situation was, if anything, worse than I'd first thought. Being immersed in such dark material, in one of the most beautiful parts of England, was sometimes unbearably poignant. Apocalyptic fears seemed unreal amidst such pastoral tranquility. It took a huge effort to imagine the kind of future we seemed to be heading for.
1984. Not the apocalyptic year that everyone had feared, except that the Mediterranean is now too polluted to fish. There have been food riots in Dhaka, and the San Onofre nuclear power station in California has been sabotaged with high explosive charges. The terrorists involved were young engineers from the Southern Justice Army, newly formed to campaign against the rich nations of the North. 1988. Shockwaves spread through the developed world with the news of the collapse of white South Africa under air attack from her African neighbors. 1993. Harvests fail in Russia and Southern Asia. Harrowing famines begin, with 1,000 million more mouths to feed than in the 1970s. America's 16 million tons grain surplus is snapped up by the Chinese ahead of the Russians, and world prices treble. The death toll in India is staggering. In 6 months, over 5 million die in Bengal alone. 1995. Washington provides prodigious emergency aid to New Delhi in the most expensive single development program in history. But sectarian disputes and regional rivalries mean most of the aid is wasted. Soon, Western public opinion demands that aid be sent only to countries with population control programs and efficient governments that will guarantee the aid is used properly. Other nations that can't be saved will be left to rot. (1998), written off as beyond saving, the poorest countries like India, Pakistan and Indonesia become desperate. They decide to give secret support to the rapidly growing Southern Justice Army in renewed nuclear terrorist demands. In response to this, Washington and Moscow grow closer together and form what becomes known as the Northern Stockade. Despite their ideological differences, East and West feel they must defend their white lager against the terrorist hordes of the poor South. World trade is now in a state of chaos, and Western European economies come close to collapse. Unemployment rises to 50%. Social welfare is abandoned. Food riots erupt as law and order breaks down. Whitehall orders the military reoccupation of the Irish Republic for its food supplies. The United States invades Canada and Mexico and drives on to establish a defense line at the Panama Canal. November 1999. The Southern Justice Army announces that they have placed nuclear devices in the harbors of Marseille, Hamburg and Southampton, which will be detonated after 24 hours unless a string of extraordinary demands is met. These include unconditional emergency food aid to India, Bangladesh and Ethiopia, and the delivery of political prisoners and ministerial hostages to Libya, together with 50 tons of gold bullion. In mounting hysteria, everyone urges the governments to give in. With only 2 hours to go, all three cities have more than 10,000 people still trapped in them. But the three cabinets secretly agree they must reject the ultimatum. Surrender now will only encourage larger threats later. The French and Germans rush their docks with volunteer troops just in time. But in Britain, as the deadline comes, a brilliant flash fills the sky over Southampton, followed by a deafening crash and mushroom cloud. Much of the city is razed and the rest is set on fire. As the cloud spreads east in a gusting wind, radioactive fallout descends in an arc from Portsmouth to Winchester and as far as the army camps of Aldershot and the tidy avenues of Guildford. From blast, fire and radiation, the final death toll is nearly 70,000. Television coverage carries the scenes across the Northern Hemisphere. Millions weep at the blackened corpses with their molten eyes.
These were imaginary pictures of our future, possible, not inevitable horrors. But for millions, the apocalypse had already arrived, for the 300 million kids with brain damage. Sometimes my dismay came so close to despair that I just couldn't write. I would wander about the lanes and only slowly realized I was close to some kind of personal crisis. Was I merely projecting onto the world a turmoil of my own, some inner destructiveness? Or was mankind really stumbling towards Armageddon? Was there any answer? The barricades or the monastery? Political passion or humble prayer? Or both? This at least was certain. We'd been no use at all until we had faced up to the seventh enemy of apathy and moral blindness inside ourselves. Perhaps we had to go through an inner crisis if we were really to see the outer crisis, today's world with all its insanities. I became obsessed with the problem of hope. Who was I to go about with a long face, like someone carrying a placard saying the end of the world is nigh, when my neighbours were quietly, often bravely, coping with the harshness of everyday life? Were they in cloud cuckoo land, or was I? They'd say we had a duty to hope. I couldn't honestly see much hope for the world. But I also knew that they had something good, which I had somehow lost. Or could we both be right in our way? I warning of calamities ahead, but they finding joy and richness in the rough textures of daily existence, where life and death were mixed together, inextricably, in every moment. Might we need both my reluctant fear for our common future, and their unspoken gratitude for every moment, on whatever terms? There was one place I often seemed drawn to, Kilpeck, a place which somehow embodied the heights as well as the depths of human experience, and which seemed to offer a clue to a way forward. And it began, know thyself. At Kilpeck Church in the 12th century, Herefordshire craftsmen had carved images of those unconscious forces I'd been wrestling with, including perhaps the face of the seventh enemy itself. Violence, wild sexuality, even humor. Real self-knowledge would mean accepting all this as part of oneself. We were not perfect and not meant to be, and the best sort of courage might lie on the other side of despair. With this acceptance began a new reverence for all of life. Our century had said God is dead. If so, it was our absurd passion for certainty and impatience with mystery which did the killing. But if religion had seemed impossible, I was finding that religious ideas were becoming inescapable. The sense of sin, the power of love. I even began to wonder whether the threats might, in a strange way, be meant to force us into awareness of the realities and needs of our time, before it was too late. And he gathered them together into a place called in the Hebrew tongue Armageddon. And the seventh angel poured out his vial into the air, and there were voices and thunders and lightnings. And there was a great earthquake such as was not since men were upon the earth. I didn't know of these writings of the pouring out of the 7 vials of wrath when I started my work, when I started thinking in terms of the 6 threats and the 7th enemy. But perhaps it's not entirely surprising that those of us through the generations who've
tried to struggle with the questions of the day, come down to deeper questions which have preoccupied men through all time. I may have started with economics and politics, ecology and the rest, and then worked through politics, yes, our own responsibility for what happens politically. But the great questions, the final questions, the religious questions, are those that concern not the outer challenge, but our inner response.
Today, Ronald Higgins works for the Richmond Fellowship. After finishing his book, The Seventh Enemy, he was offered the job of assistant director of the fellowship, running halfway houses for the mentally ill and emotionally disturbed. But in devoting himself to this work, he doesn't believe he's abandoning his concern with the global crisis.
We're working here in our own third world, with some of the most blighted lives in British society. We're trying to find ways through to each other.
I think it's very important, you know, and it's tragic, Tom, it's really...
Both staff and residents are trying to grapple in an unsentimental way with depression, anger and inadequacy, trying to combine care with honest confrontation.
You know, it's fairly obvious that Maggie's a plan. Yeah, I know, we know that you were making plans last night.
I think that the core of the problem lies with us as individuals, because it is we in turn who make a difference to what sort of politics we have. But I do very much believe that the political dimension is real in itself. But it seems to me impudent and imprudent for me to say, you, some face out of the crowd, ought to do X, Y, and Z. You ought to throw all your energies into Oxfam, or into playgroups, or into education, or learning about the food problem, or campaigning up in Scotland about the latest reactor, or whatever. I think self-knowledge by itself isn't enough. Whenever I can, I lecture, campaign if you like, stressing that personal change must be translated into practical action. If the seventh enemy is inertia and apathy, ways through must be found, and this is the critical generation.
Kathy Shaw from Wickham Abbey. I know there aren't any single solutions to this problem of individual apathy, but I was wondering, don't you think it could be solved probably through the system of education?
How do you feel about people who don't want to bother with other people's problems, but would rather just let the world pass them by? Do you find it disconcerting that minority groups such as the Friends of the Earth, who have a genuine concern for some of the problems you've mentioned, are so often dismissed as sort of idealists and romanticists by those in authority and weirdos and freaks by apathetic masses?
Don't you think that the advantages of nuclear power are much greater than any minor pollution problem you may have?
Spiritually, the church has always provided us with some kind of support. Now we're beginning to be disillusioned by it. Can you see any form of spiritual revolution coming forward?
There was a meeting of the Connecticut Assembly in 1780, and there'd been much talk of a day of judgment, and there was a darkening of the sky this particular afternoon, thunder, lightning, the whole works, and the Assembly fell into a sort of despond, and then the Speaker of the Assembly rose and gave his ruling. He said, either this is the end of the world, or it is not. If it is not, our business should proceed. If it is, I prefer to be found doing my duty. Let lights be brought.
But having told people what they can choose between, shouldn't you try and follow that up and make sure they do one of those things?
What right have I to...
But somebody's got to take that responsibility.
What about you?
Before today, I wasn't presented with the facts. I wasn't aware of those things.
Well, from now on, you're all right.
Okay.